Welcome to my spare room studio. Today I'm going to colour in Christine Karron's Wildflower Folk colouring book using Kuretake, Gansai, Tambi watercolour paints, and this is the Art Nouveau range. To start with the skin, I've used a combination of ecru beige and coral pink with a bit of potter's pink, I think. So this beginning part of the video is in real-time speed. Later on I do speed the footage up a little bit because it's very much more of the same thing. But I want you to see the real-time speed of how long it takes me to paint with watercolors. And then later on it's just a case of showing you a bit of various aspects to the page being painted, but you don't really need to see it in real time. I use an awful lot of water when I work with watercolour, and this isn't ideal for colouring books, but I do push on and persevere using the water, and I'll use as much as my paper can tolerate. It does leave my colouring books very wrinkled and crinkled, but for me that's a small price to pay for working in the manner that I enjoy most. You will also notice that I'm using quite a large brush here. It's a round brush, and I'm not sure, that is either a size 12 or a size 16 that I'm using there. These brushes have a very fine point, so even though they're a large brush, it does allow me to get into some fairly small areas there and some detail. But using a large brush and lots of water in the beginning means that I start off with a very loose and abstract washy style of colour, and that's what I'm looking for to start with. I also try to start with a reasonably light colour for my first wash, and you can see here that if there's excess water or excess paint, I dry the brush off on a piece of paper towel, and using just a slightly damp brush I can actually lift back a fair amount of water and paint with the brush. Watercolour requires you to start with a fairly light layer in the beginning because you cannot reinstate highlights later on in a watercolour painting unless you use a white gouache or some sort of gel pen or a white pencil even. And I always try to avoid that if I can. So my goal is always to try and start out with a purely watercolour painting. If I have to add other things at the end, then so be it, but my goal is to always try and achieve what I want to do with watercolour alone in the beginning. You may not like to work like that, and so your working method might be different, knowing that you're going to add pencils later, but I try and achieve everything at the beginning with just watercolour. So you can see here I'm using a large amount of water to do this area of her tail. So this is vermilion, and then I'm using a bit of coral pink, and I think it's potter's pink, to mix into her tail. And what I like to do is put one colour down first, and then on that very wet paper, that very wet paint, I like to touch the tip of the brush to the paint with my next colour and let it blend and bleed on the paper itself. This means that I have a very random effect. I have a very loose idea of what it might look like, but it is completely random, and I have absolutely no control over how this is going to work out. And so how it looks here in the beginning when it's very wet is not how it's going to look when it's dry either. The colours do change a little bit as they dry, and those colours will continue to blend together as they're drying, and they will not necessarily look like they do here. For some people, the randomness and lack of control over the result will not be comfortable at all. But for me, that is part of the joy of watercolour, is the unexpected surprises that you get by letting go of expectation and allowing the watercolour to do its thing and try not to control it too much. I do come back later in paintings and pictures when I have a better idea of how things are looking and what I want to achieve, and I will try to control things then. I use a smaller brush and a lot less water to do that. But in these early stages, I try to loosen up my style a little bit and work this way and just see what happens, because some of these things are quite unexpected. I call them happy accidents. And if the results are not to your liking, as long as you don't work too dark or too deep in your tone, you can always adjust with further layers of watercolour as you go along. I think watercolour is the perfect medium if you want to try and loosen up your style. If you want to have very tightly controlled blends and lots of tiny details, then perhaps coloured pencils or markers are going to be the way to go for you. You can create some of this, of course, with watercolour and a very small brush, but you do need to have reasonable brush skills to achieve that, and it may take you a bit of practice to achieve that. I apologise here for the colour blowing out, but it will get better as time goes on. So this footage here has been sped up now, it's a lot faster. And I'm starting to put some colours down again to mix together on the page and do their own sort of blending. So there's a combination here of saffron yellow, green gold and ecru beige that I'm using for this area. And later I do bring in some mixes of Mars yellow and Venetian red. It sounds like a lot of colours, but you can see on my palette there, I'm actually not using very much. I'm usually only picking up a little bit of colour with the tip of my brush and applying it, and I actually have not used very much paint out of my paint palette itself yet either. So a little bit of watercolour does go a long way, and you can always later bring in more concentrated amounts of colour as you need them. So again, I'm trying to be really loose. I'm not focusing on details too much at this stage. I'm just trying to roughly plan where I want certain colours to be, but you can see by the way that those colours are blending together with the wet colour already on the paper that I'm really not in control of that at all. It's really vague and abstract in the way that I'm applying the colour. And then later on is when details and other things can be done to bring the picture back into much more detail. So if I didn't mention, I did use vermilion for her tail. So I'm using the Art Nouveau curated set by Gansai Tambi, by Kuretake, the Gansai Tambi watercolour paints. And the reason that I chose the curated set for this picture is that I liked the colours, but I know that all of the colours that I choose from this palette are going to work together reasonably well. Because they've been curated to work together in this manner, I don't have to put too much thought into choosing my colours. I just know that they're all going to work together. And then the colours that I mix from using these as a base, again, will all tone in well together, and I don't really have to put too much thought into it. So with her tail here, I'm now going back and starting to put a little bit more detail in. So Christine Karron is very good at giving us a lot of grayscale and showing us where shadows and shading needs to be done, and also some very loose little details there on the tail. So rather than drawing each scale in, what I'm doing with the watercolour is just putting in general shapes. So just little half circles, dots and dabs and little strokes of colour, which will suggest what fish scales look like, is what I was hoping for. So she reminded me of a chubby little goldfish, and so that was kind of what I had in my mind as I was painting this. The sort of look that I wanted her to have was rather fun and a little bit cheeky. So Again, I didn't really want to have to sit and painstakingly draw every scale in, and I think it wouldn't have matched the style of the picture anyway, so I'm just using really loose, very relaxed painting strokes to describe what I'm trying to tell you without actually drawing every detail in. As I go through successive layers of watercolour, the challenge for me personally is to not obliterate all of the fun watercolour effects by getting too tightly controlled and detailed. So my natural inclination is to go for detail. That's how I used to draw when I created my own pieces of original art. I like to have lots of detail, and I tried to get as realistic as I could. With watercolour you can achieve that, but again I just think that the natural tendency of watercolour is to create much more relaxed pictures, and so I'm trying to force myself to loosen up my style and keep working with watercolour because it forces me to do that. You'll also see through different parts of the video, if you notice, I'm holding the brush back a long way at times, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the paper may be quite wet under my hand, so I'm actually having to hold my hand up away from the paper. I can't rest it on the paper. And also, the further back you hold the paintbrush, the more relaxed your painting strokes are going to be. So it's very hard to put fine details in when you are holding a paintbrush so far back along the barrel of the brush, and also when you can't rest your hand on the paper. Now you might be able to see there, I've actually got my little finger just gently resting against the dry parts of the page, but my hand is actually away from the page for the most part there. So that's something you have to think about when you're working with watercolour, is it's usually best to start in the top left corner and work across and down if you're right-handed, and the opposite way for left-handed. But of course I don't necessarily follow all the rules, and I forget to do that a lot of the time. So it will mean that you will have long periods of time waiting for the paper to dry so that you can proceed, or you need to do like I'm doing there and develop some more controlled brush skills, not being able to rest your hand on the paper, or just using your little finger to gently rest against the page, and most of the work is being done by the movement of your hand. Here with the hair, what I like to do is start with a reasonably light layer of colour so that this will become my highlights in the hair. So the lighter that you start with that first layer of colour and then build up with subsequent layers of colour, those very early layers are what makes the highlights in your picture. So that's why it's really, really important to work in layers, and you need to think backwards. You need to think about your highlights first, whereas quite often when we're colouring we put the highlights in last using an acrylic gel pen or acrylic paint pen, for example, or a white coloured pencil. We put those highlights in last a lot of the time. With watercolour you really need to think about them first and then build your colour up around those highlights. It can be a little bit tricky, but it comes a lot easier as you paint more and more often, and allow yourself to just have those little accidents until you just find that one day it will suddenly click in your mind, and before you know it you'll have a beautiful watercolour painting. I don't like to do individual strands of hair very often, so what I'm looking for is the light and dark shades, and concentrating on those to start with, and then at the end I may put some individual strands there. So this section I'm showing you in real time again how slowly I work when I'm doing the details for the eyes here. when you're doing things like eyelashes on eyes and eyebrows and so on, you need to have the rest of the face fairly well defined and painted, because it's very difficult to come back in around every little individual eyelash if you decide that you want to add more colour. I still make the mistake, and I have to work really carefully to try and remedy that. But if you can make sure that everything around that eye is the colour that you want to start with, it will be much easier to then paint the details like the eyelids, the eyelashes, the eyebrows and so on, and not have to work around them later. So I'm using a combination here of cobalt green, shadow green and pea green for the eyes. Very, very small amounts of paint were needed for this, and this particular set, the Art Nouveau range, does not have black, so I supplemented black from the regular Kuretake Gansai Tambi range of paints. I don't normally like to use a lot of black in watercolours because I feel like black deadens the colour, but there are some times when you really do need that little touch of black, and especially when it comes to the pupil in the eye, and in something like this where the females have, you know, very well defined eyelashes and look like they might be wearing makeup, you quite often need that little touch of black in there just to help define and describe some of those fine details. But I try not to use too much of it, and if you limit the use of it, it becomes much more effective and makes a dramatic difference to the rest of the page if you've used colours like this one where it's quite bright and fun. That little tiny pop of black helps to bring the focus into her eyes before you look at anything else on the picture. What I'm doing here is pretty much following all the cues that Christine has drawn in for us in the original drawing. So there's quite a bit of grayscale to tell you where shadows are needed, and all I can really say is that I recommend a very light touch. You can always add more to watercolour, but you can never really take away. So if you do it very gradually and build your colours up, and if you feel like you're getting a little bit too heavy or too fiddly with it, walk away, let it dry, maybe work on something else while it's drying, and then come back to it with a fresh perspective, and you may realise that you've got more than enough on there already and you don't need to add any more. Watercolour is quite a contradiction for me in that it is fast in the sense that you can use large brushes and cover large areas with really loose washes very quickly. So things like background and large areas, they get painted really quickly. But then when it comes to this part of a painting where I want some fine details, it slows everything down, you know, quite a bit. So I need to concentrate on my brush skills. I need to think about what I'm trying to achieve, and I'm trying to remember not to overdo things. So this is where it becomes much slower, and I particularly like working with watercolour because it does force me to think about what I'm doing a lot more. It's not mindless, it's actually mindful, because I have to pay attention to what I'm doing. It means that I block everything else out. So if I've got something on my mind that I'm worried about, I can't really concentrate on thinking about that at the same time as doing these details. And so I find that watercolour is really relaxing, and it helps me to empty my mind of everything else that's bothering me. So hopefully you can see that watercolour is indeed very versatile. So you can use your big brushes, your very washy colours, and get some really abstract fun results. And then you can also get a fine brush and work with your paint in a more concentrated manner and use it to create some really fine details. So The important thing for me when I do watercolour is I'm trying to get a balance of both. I don't want to have a dominance of one over the other, and I'm trying to just create areas of interest and help the viewer have their eye flow around the picture. So hopefully I don't keep repeating myself too much, because I am filming this in sections and going away in between and doing other things, and I've forgotten what I say some of the time. But this section I'm actually painting negative space. So I'm going around the stones rather than painting the stones themselves, and that initial wash of colour, which I think was mostly saffron yellow with a bit of green gold in there, that becomes the colour of the stones, and now I'm using a darker mix and I'm going around and painting the negative space to make the stones stand out. Here I'm doing the opposite and using the darker colour to suggest the stones and leaving the saffron yellow as the negative space around the stones. So just working in that different manner creates some interesting effects, and you can put that to good use at times. Here I'm just following the cues that Christine has drawn on and attempting to do some freckles across the bridge of her nose there and her cheeks. So at this point I'm just trying to warm things up a little bit. Again, the grayscale can make skin look a little bit dull at times. So I'm just gradually building up that colour, and I don't want it to get too garish or too bright, but just gradually building up the layers of colour. once I'm happy with the way that colours are looking, it now becomes a case of starting to put some details in and finish things off to a bit more of a polished effect. And I'm using various strokes again to try and describe those fish scales and the fins. And I'm trying to be conscious of the fact with the fins that I want the watercolour to stay translucent, and I don't necessarily want it to be too solid and dark. The areas of the tail and the body, of course, would be much more substantial in nature, so it's okay to go darker and more saturated with the colours there. But on the fins, I wanted to try and keep that translucent properties of the watercolour. It appears that I jump around from section to section of the picture, and I do that for a couple of reasons. One being that I often forget about the correct order of working, and so when one area is wet, I need to move to a different area of the page to work so that I don't smudge or ruin the wet areas. And also I like to keep jumping around at this stage to keep the intensity of the colour in mind. So I don't really want to get too dominant with one area over another, and I like to keep working with layers and work all over the picture so that I keep everything in a good balance. If I just did all the hair, for example, and then went to work on another area and something happened there that meant that the hair looked like it was out of balance, it would be hard to fix it. So I like to try and keep an eye on the whole picture, the overall composition, and keep moving around it. I don't know if that is the correct way or not, but it is just the way that feels comfortable for me and helps me to maintain that balance of colour and not get too out of kilter. So I'm returning to real-time speed here for you to see how I'm painting the background. I'm turning my thoughts to what colours I want to use and how I can best complement that vermilion red of the tail there. So a little bit of colour theory is very helpful when it comes to choosing colours where you really want to make one colour play off against another. And I don't really have the knowledge or skills to describe it entirely to you. So I suggest if you want to learn a little bit about colour theory that you Google colour theory, or perhaps check out some channels on YouTube where people are actually giving art instruction and talking about colour mixing and colour theory, and they will explain it far better than I can. I think at this point I start to do things from instinct rather than thinking about it too much, and that really just comes from painting for a long time or using colour and working with it for a long time. So what I've done is I've used clean water to wet the page first, and I don't get too close to the edges when I first start, and then I try and get closer and closer. Now it's really important that you wait until everything is dry before you try doing something like this, because if that tail was still wet or her hair was still wet, it's all just going to bleed together and make one big mess. So it's really good if you can wait until the main body of the picture is dry and then have a go at doing this. And what I'm trying to do is just very carefully get as close to the edge of the picture as I can. And sometimes with this big brush I can't really get in where I want to get, so I leave a very, very fine line of white paper where I don't quite go up to the edge of the picture. And I can tidy that up later with a smaller brush, but at this point in time I just try to get as close as I can. And occasionally I do go over the main body of the picture, and I will either use a clean dry brush to lift that colour back off, or sometimes I just use my finger to try and push the colour back off. What you've seen me just do is put some clean colour into an area of paint, and that clean colour will, clean water, will push all the pigment away, and it will cause a bit of a watercolour bloom, which I do talk about further in the video. The Gansai Tambi watercolours do tend to sit on the surface of the paper for a little bit longer than what traditional watercolours do, and that gives you the opportunity to move it around, but it also means when you do put it in the wrong place, if you're really quick, you can manage to lift most of that colour back off. At this point I'm trying not to get that colour onto the main body of the picture, but if I do, I can always come back later with a fine brush and touch some of those areas up if I need to. Many people do the background first, and that makes a lot of sense, but I quite often start painting and I don't know exactly what colours I'm going to use until I get started. And then that's why I use or tend to leave the background to last, because I want the main subject of the painting first, and then I use something complementary for the background. It would be a lot easier if I did all of this sort of thing first and then did the main body of the picture where I could come over the top of it. But like I said, I'm not always good at following things in the correct order, and this is just something that I've developed over the years, and I just make it work for me. But this may not be for everybody, and you do need a steady hand to be able to get in there. And this brush really is a little bit too big for the area that I'm currently trying to paint, but it's a good example to show you of possibly what not to do. Again, you can see where there's too much. I'm using the drier brush and the clean brush just to lift that excess colour out, excess water out. So the larger brushes, if they're a good, good brush, you can actually soak up water and paint with the brush and remove it. You might be able to see there as it's drying where I put the clean water into the paint, it's already starting to dry lighter and it's pushing the pigment away. Here I'm using a small brush and I'm just taking a bit of paint back from that big puddle of water that has collected there, and I'm using it to get into the really, really small tight areas. That is the smallest brush that I've got out to use on this picture, and that is a size 1. So that's a perfect example there to show you just how much I can pick back up with that clean dry brush. And as I roll the bristles, you can see that I'm getting quite an interesting effect there. Now this is a perfect example of what I call a happy accident. I had no idea it was going to do that. That was just chance that it did it, and I thought that it looked really quite effective to help describe a watery type of effect. So I had no idea that that would happen ahead of time, and that's exactly why I recommend that everybody have a go at loosening up and have a willingness to play, because I didn't know that that was going to happen until I did it. If you get too tightly controlled and too rigid in the way that you approach things, you just don't allow for these happy accidents to happen. So I've left a lot of things in this video because I want you to see that there are many ways that you can approach watercolour, and there's a lot of unexpected stuff that happens with watercolour too. And sometimes that can be of a positive nature and sometimes it's negative, but it's all part of the process. And I think that having a willingness for these things to happen is really where the best breakthroughs are found and where you learn the most about your art supplies. So here I'm actually using quite concentrated paint now that I've picked up from the paint palette, and I'm applying it to a very damp area of paper and just letting it bleed on its own. But you can see that the colour is much more concentrated than what I've used so far. Here I'm just using the brush to drag that paint out and to try and encourage it to bleed in a certain way. And of course this will do its own thing. The paint will just follow the water and it will just go, you know, wherever it's going to go of its own accord. I can encourage it a little bit with a brush, but you know, once I leave it alone and let it keep blending, the result is out of my hands and a little bit more unexpected. Something that I'd just like to say too here is that watercolour paper is much more hardy and will stand up to more playing around with it, but colouring book paper won't. So if the paper is very wet and you keep messing around with a brush and rubbing at the surface of the paper, you will tear it and you will peel the paper, and you're just at the very least going to disturb the surface of the paper. So just be aware of that. It's okay if you're using a softer brush, but if you're using a firmer bristled brush, then you're going to be at risk of tearing your paper. And really, it's not ideal to keep messing with things for too long, because that's when you start to get really muddy colours and muddy results. But you can gently manipulate the paint to a certain degree, and again, this is something that I find is really difficult to describe or teach someone to do, because you really can only learn these sorts of things by doing it yourself and experimenting and seeing what works and what doesn't. So here on this side of the paper, I'm going to be a little bit more careful because I don't want my water to run into the inside of the book. If you let water get inside the binding, sometimes it does seep through and stain other pages. So it's a good idea to try and not let too much water settle in the centre of your book there. And I could have used washi tape to mask that area off, but I didn't want a straight regular line there either. I wanted it to simulate, you know, water splashes or water spills and mirror the right hand side of the page a little bit. So I didn't really want that line that masking tape or washi tape would have left. But if you're doing a regular background where you're wanting a nice neat finish, you can use washi tape to mask off those areas where you want to create a smoother border. I'm just using my brush here to get some random edges, but I have played in the past with using a straw to blow the watery paint in different directions to get sort of paint splatter effects, or I will drip watery paint from quite a high height and let it splat onto the page. But this is so close to the main picture here that I don't want to risk any paint splashes or splatters getting over the tail or her hair, so I've just used the brush. So you can experiment with other things, you know, if you've got a pipette or an eyedropper or something like that, and you want to have a go with different paint effects, you can do all that sort of thing. I would recommend doing it on a blank piece of paper first and just seeing how far things do splatter and splash to give you an idea before you have a go at doing it on a page. There are also things like using an old toothbrush to splatter and spray paint on for different types of effects as well. So there are so many different ways that you can apply watercolour that you know, I'm just not going to touch on in a colouring book, but you could practice maybe in a sketchbook or on some blank paper and have a go with all those sorts of things before you commit to doing it on a colouring book page. Another thing that people do, and I didn't think to do it here on this page, but you can sprinkle salt into damp areas of paint, and what the salt does is the salt sucks or drags the water towards it and leaves some really unusual watery looking effects into the paint. So that might be something I try on another page, but there are plenty of people who've done it before me, and if you Google it, you may find some examples where people have done that as well. So that's quite effective and a fun result to use in the background of pages that you either want to suggest water or just a really abstract, dreamy sort of looking background. So here you can see that the deeper colour of the cobalt green really does work well with the vermilion. And that is again what I was touching on with the colour theory. They're complementary colours, and so they really do make each other pop when you use them together. It really makes that red come alive. And if I had used another colour behind there, it would not necessarily have been such a nice effect. But that is what I was touching on briefly with colour theory. And there are many, many resources on the internet that you can have a look at for learning about that. So at this point of the video, I'd like to talk about a few things. I'm getting really close to the end now, and this has been worked on over a number of days because you do have to wait for watercolour to dry, which is one of the drawbacks in the cooler weather, that it can take some time to dry and then you get busy. So while I've been working on this one, I've also been working on another page. But I thought that I'd show you that I've still got my leftover paint that I haven't used, and it has dried up in my paint palettes, but I can just put a bit of water on there and reconstitute it and work with them again. It's clean, it hasn't been dusty or anything, so the colours aren't contaminated by anything, so it's just a case of adding some extra water to it and reusing it, and that way I'm guaranteed that I'm going to have the same colours that I've used on the picture so far. So just to point out a few things, I worked very wet here in the background, so it has started to cockle the page up quite a bit. I will just put a clip on here to hold that down while I finish working on that last bit, so bear with me while I just pop that little clip on there. That just helps keep the page down a bit better, and I probably could do with another one off to the side if truth be told, but anyway. So yes, very wet in wet over here, and you can see that possibly let's hope that all the lighting and everything is good here, but hopefully you can see that I've got some what's called watercolor bloom. So where the watercolor was still quite wet, I actually dropped clean water into it, and the clean water pushes the pigment off to the edges, and you get that hard edges. Some people call it cauliflower or bloom, you know, something like that. So technically in traditional watercolour that was sort of frowned on. People didn't really want those watercolour blooms. But I find it very interesting. It's something that I like to look at, and particularly for a background that's abstract, or in this case suggesting maybe a watery background, it's actually quite helpful to help describe that very watery look. So what I started off doing was using quite a large brush, so I've used two brushes here. They are the Montmartre round in a 12 and a 16, so quite large, but you can see that they form a really good point. So that's why I use the larger ones to start working in that really loose abstract way. And then I've got the number 8 round and the number 1 round as well for doing smaller details. So what I will usually do at this stage of a picture is I want to preserve quite a bit of that washy look, but I would like to come in a little bit closer to some of the edges here. I've got quite a bit of white showing here, and it's a little bit untidy in places around the hair, so I might tidy that up a little bit. But also the hair itself is something that I just want to touch up a little bit more. So I'm just going to re-wet my brushes and get the tips nice and pliable again. And I use old jars for my water tubs, so that means that I can put the lid back on and keep it nice and safe while it's on my table, that it's not going to get knocked over when I'm not using it. And I'm just going to bring back my palette that I've been working with here. This combination down here was a mix of Mars yellow and Venetian red, and possibly a little bit of black put in there for some details, but I'm going to use that. And I'm sorry for leaning across, it's really hard to work out where to put a water dish where it's not going to affect the, you know, put a light over, shadow over the page, but I also need to be conscious of not working over my page with too much water or wet paint at this stage, because if it drips, I'm going to be annoyed. So what I will do at this point in time usually is come back and start to put in a few darks. And at this point of the picture, it's usually going to be less diluted or wet and a little bit more concentrated. because then I can add some detail. And what I need to be conscious of at this point in doing any sort of picture, whether it be my own original art or a colouring book page, is that I want to preserve some of the very loose, washy, abstract areas, you know, where I've got effects that I particularly like with the watercolour. I want to preserve those. And then this is just enhancing or reinstating some detail where I need it, but I don't want to completely obliterate all the fun stuff. And it's really just trying to get that balance of having some tight, detailed areas and some nice graduated blends, while having some really fun areas that are a little bit more impressionistic, or you know, shows a little bit more maybe personality, because I feel that when we have lots of tight details, careful blends and so on, it can very easily become boring, and it can very easily lack personality. So have a think about that in your own pages, that too much of something can be too much of something can be a bad thing, and a little bit of variety just helps to add a little bit of personality, a little bit of something to your page. So I'm not boo-hooing on realism and, you know, all the details and what have you, because I like it myself, I really do. And it's been a bit of a journey for me to loosen up my style and not rely on that for a whole picture, but to actually incorporate some different things. So I just thought I would mention it to you. It's not about judging or criticising or commenting on anybody else. It's just something that I've thought about in my own work quite a lot. And, you know, over the years I've had discussions with friends in the art groups that I've been a part of, and obviously tutors and so on, that we all have very, very different ideas of what, you know, what good art is, and it's all very subjective. But I share my thoughts and my opinions just in a manner that, you know, it might help you out a little bit, especially if you're just starting out. And I share my thoughts and my ideas with you just as, you know, starting points for you to think about things if you'd like to take your art a little bit further, a little, you know, step further. And you may not want to, and that's okay. You know, I'm a very big advocate of colouring can just be flat, you know, saturated colouring, and it's still a valuable thing to have. And it's still a valuable thing to do, because it's all about the enjoyment of the hobby, especially for me it is anyway. So I'm not saying that you have to do any of this. It's just, you know, little ideas to get you started if you are interested in taking things a step further and thinking a little bit more deeply about what you want from your colouring. And don't forget that this could just be a kickstart for you into bigger things. Some people have found that they come to colouring when they have been creating their own work, and they just need to decompress and play with colour, and they want to forego the whole drawing process and just jump into, you know, painting and colouring. And so painting and colouring other people's designs is very relaxing and very rewarding in its own right. And then there are some people that start out with this and then they become really quite entranced by it all and start to look at the possibilities, you know, for themselves, that perhaps they've always wanted to dabble with watercolour or art at some stage and never had the time to, never had the money perhaps to buy the supplies, and they now might find themselves in a position where they can. And so sometimes just colouring in other people's artwork and in books and so on kickstarts a whole creative journey of its own for somebody else. So the possibilities are endless, and it's all there for you to make as much or as little of it as you want. I guess that's what I'm trying to say more than anything, is that we always have options and we always have choice, and we can make it as much or as little as we want it to be. So what I'm going to do here is just sort of concentrate on the hair a little bit. I'm pretty much sort of at the point where I'm happy with a lot of the background and everything. I'm happy with her face. You may have seen, if you're on Instagram, I did a few little short reels of doing different things just to give you a feel for what I've been doing on this page. But I'm pretty sort of happy with where I am. This has taken me, as I mentioned, a few days to work on at various times, because I've had to wait for it to dry and then got distracted with other things, or you know, the weekend came and I was busy. I didn't have time to work on it over the weekend. And so that's something to keep in mind with watercolour too, that for some of you, you're going into summer now, so you're going to have quicker drying times, so watercolour might be a little bit more accessible for you. But for those of us going into winter, it slows our drying time down quite considerably, especially when you work as wet as I do. If you don't tend to wet your page overly much, you might not find it's too big a deal, but for me personally, I do, so it can take a while to have that fully dry. And I know that I can use a hairdryer, but I find with the hairdryer sometimes the page doesn't necessarily dry quite as flat. You know, like it doesn't dry evenly. The hairdryer might dry one part a little bit more quickly than others, and I just find that the wrinkling and the cockling can be a bit more pronounced sometimes when I use the hairdryer. So I'm just using a little bit more Mars yellow and Venetian red here, and I'm going to put a little touch of black. I had to take the black from my other set because it doesn't have black in the Art Nouveau range. And you can see there I've just made a cooler brown, so the black, adding the black just a tiny bit, because black can really deaden your colours, but Mars yellow and Venetian red are quite warm colours, and I've used the black just to cool that brown down a little bit. There is no brown like I really want in the Art Nouveau range, so I'm just making my own there. Pardon me. And you know, I'm just going to use that selectively for areas where there may be a little bit more of a shadow. And just, as I say, really, really selectively. So if you've owned a Christine Karron book, you'll know that Christine does put a lot of grayscale in her images, which give us an idea where things will be in shadow or need some sort of form defined. And just, you know, vary your brush strokes. You know, if you're having a go, you don't have to use all the same brush stroke. You can pat the paper gently, you can use big sweeping strokes, you can use dots, you can do all sorts of things. And I'm just going to put a little tiny bit of that into some areas here where I've tried to suggest that she's got some scales. And I haven't drawn each scale in. What I've done is just used a few shapes to try and describe the shape of scales and give you the impression that that's what's there without actually drawing it in. So watercolour is very good for doing very, very basic loose shapes to describe what you're trying to depict. And again, you know, don't go too overboard. I'm not going to do the same thing everywhere or it will just start to get tedious. Very light touch with a fine brush, you can get some fine lines. And that's really all I'm going to do with that for her tail probably. And then down here, I'm just going to do a little bit more around here in the deeper colour. And again, I'm not going to draw in every pebble and stone. What I'm doing is just doing some very loose shapes to describe that that's what might be there without actually drawing it. So if you're familiar with the art of the Impressionists, what they used to do was give you an impression of something. So they didn't draw every detail and every shape. They just suggested some bits here and there and enough to give your eye some information, and then you fill in the story with your own knowledge. And that's why some people interpret some images as one thing and other people will interpret it as other things, because we have very different databases in our brains of knowledge. But the artist does enough to just suggest things for us and we fill in the rest. And that's what makes art very personal and very subjective, because we see things in very different ways. And we've got very different experiences which help us to fill in the stories, to fill in the blanks. And that's why rarely does a piece of artwork, you know, have the same reaction in every viewer. And that's what makes it, you know, interesting. We can take a photograph and we're all pretty much, you know, in agreement about what we're seeing with a photograph. But again, how we interpret what the photographer is telling us will be very different given the life experiences and so on that we have. So here you can see again, I've got some of those water blooms or cauliflower effects, and I'm really happy with leaving those where they are. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm actually painting the negative space. So I'm not painting the stones, but I'm painting around them so that that yellow, which was saffron yellow I think it was, is showing through as the stone colour, because I'm painting around the negative space. So I'm not going to get too fussy with the skin either. I'm quite happy the way that is. I've got some really nice finely blended areas. I've got some looser washy areas here where I've started to try and describe here that the texture of her skin might be very similar to the texture of her tail. And I'm quite happy to leave that as it is. I might just darken in there a little fraction. And hopefully, I know that I have edited the footage quite a bit and I will be cutting bits out and not showing you every sort of tedious bit of painting, but I hope from what you've seen on this one, you can see that it's definitely a process of starting lighter and then keep coming back and darkening it up with successive layers of colour. So you don't want to go too dark too soon. And also it's a constant re-evaluating of is that the wash when it dries, is it telling the information that I want it to? If it's too abstract and too washy, or there are hard edges, then the next layer I will alter that a little bit again. So it's a constant process of back and forward, and it needs to be done quite subtly with the colour, and until you're confident. If you're really confident, you know what you're doing is the right colour and you're happy with that, it will be a much faster process. But as a learner, I think it's great to start off very, very light layers and just build up your colour. But the only thing I would say that there's a danger of doing this is that you can overwork it, and if you choose the wrong colours and overlay the wrong colours, you will get mud. And what I mean by that is obviously if you overlay colours that make brown, you will dirty all your colours quite a bit. But again, that's something you kind of need to learn by doing, and it's a process of you know, experimenting and doing to realise at what point you need to stop fiddling and leave it alone. So I just wanted a little bit of extra colour in there because it still had quite a bit of grey showing through. So yeah, getting pretty close here, because I think if I keep fiddling too much, I'm going to overdo things and lose some of the nicer effects that I have. But I just want to do her little fingernail there, like she's got some nail polish on there, and give her hands and fingers just a little bit of something, just to describe the form a little bit better. And you can see I'm using very, very little paint now. I'm just re-wetting what I've got, and it's not very much paint on the brush at all. And I'm just using Christine's drawing, her little bit of grayscale, to give me an idea where a little bit of shadow might be needed. And I just keep taking excess off of my brush on the paper towel, and now it's barely damp at all, and I'm just feathering that to blend out that colour a little bit more softly. So some areas you can do really, really fine blends. Use that just barely damp brush to pat or blend out the colour a little bit. And then other areas you might feel like you want more of a hard edge or a hard line because it was a shadow or something like that. And you can leave a bit more of a harder defined line there. And I can't tell you when, you know, when you should stop, when you should do this, when you should do that, or how you should do things exactly, because you know, part of it is just your artistic interpretation too, and you need to discover that for yourself. If you have someone constantly telling you, no, don't put the paint there, do this, use that colour, you know, do it this way, you're actually not going to discover your own artistic voice, your own artistic personality. There are some basic techniques, obviously, that, you know, apply to everybody, but to be honest, I don't really follow a lot of the shoulds when it comes to watercolour. My art teacher used to shake his head, and in the end he would give up saying anything to me and he'd just walk away, because he'd say, I don't know why you're doing it that way, but it's working and you're enjoying it, so he just left me to it. So when I share this with you, it's really about just sharing my techniques so that you can see this is how I create the images that I do, but it's not necessarily a how-to, because I certainly don't follow all the rules myself. And there will be some very proficient, highly trained artists and watercolorists who would shake their head at me as well, but it is what it is. And I'm working in a colouring book. I'm not working on watercolour paper, so again, I'm not necessarily getting the same effects as what I do when I work on a sheet of watercolour paper. So there's so many variables when it comes to creating your art that you need to have a bit of an element of adaptability, that you can just accept what happens and learn from it and keep going. Okay, so that will need to dry again. I think that's pretty much how I'm going to leave it now. I really am at risk of fiddling too much and, you know, overworking things. So I'm just going to show you how it looks. So just a bit of a close-up here for you. Hopefully you can see things well. But you can see there's a little bit of a texture too. The paper is showing through there. And you can see that, you know, there is some fine blending, but there are also some obvious lines. You know how I've done the freckles there. For her scales, it's a lot of dobs and dabs and, you know, little strokes of colour and half circles and so on. And this is what I was talking about, how I have like a fine line of white where I couldn't take the water of, you know, the blue. When I was painting with the blue, couldn't take it right up to the fin because that was still a bit damp, so I had to stop back from the line a little bit. You can hopefully see there with the sandy area that I've got a few watercolour blooms. I like the way that looks. It's a very personal thing whether you like it or you don't. Here is where I was working in the negative area, so painting around the stones and not the stones themselves. And I don't mind the line showing through. That looks a bit like an original pencil drawing showing through. I don't mind that. Some people don't like it and they will take a darker colour up to the edge and colour that line up so that they can't see it. So that's obviously the largest watercolour bloom that I've got there, or cauliflower effect, and I'm quite happy to leave that alone. I don't mind that at all. I could potentially bring it closer in around here and blend that a little bit more carefully, but I'm not too fussed about it. And here is where I have wet the paper and then used some quite concentrated paint in there to get that deep colour, because I wanted a combination of very saturated deep colour and very watery light colour. And here is where when I try to describe to you the white of the paper showing through the paint, this is sort of what I'm talking about. You can see that you've got a hint of that, you know, bare paper about it. It isn't, it's got a very fine wash, but it's very, very diluted. So I hope that helps if you are new to watercolour and some of the terms might be a little bit confusing and so on, or how people get different effects. I hope that this video has been helpful in showing you a little bit of that, and please bear in mind that I will reiterate again that this is just my method. It isn't the only method, and it's not particularly even the correct method of working with watercolour. But this is how I like to work, and this is the sort of effect that I like to create, and gives me joy working this way. It gives me joy looking at the pages afterwards when I finish. So please keep that in mind. I know that there are other ways and there are other things that can be done, and there will be people who say that what I've done is not correct, but this is what gives me joy. This is what gives me pleasure. So I hope that you can keep that in mind when you're looking at this. It's always just ideas for you to either try or discard. It's entirely up to you. So thank you for joining me. I know it's a slightly longer video again, but watercolour is a bit of a process and it can be quite slow. So do be prepared for that, and perhaps do like I have done and have a couple of pages on the go at once while you're working, so that you can put it aside for this one to dry and then take up another one while you're waiting. Okay, I hope you're all well. Take care everyone, and I'll see you again soon. Bye now.